Hi, and welcome to the second last module of English Linguistics 315. We are getting into pragmatics today, and this is the next module after semantics. You have an idea of how to put together words into bigger structure. You know how to get meaning from these structures. And now what we're going to get into is we're getting into the area of applied linguistics a little bit, because we are talking about context and how context can actually affect the way we interpret things and the meaning that we associate with not just words, but sentences and other kinds of things. Before we get into the lecture, I want to invite all of you to the second talk in the Language and Linguistics Colloquium series. This is happening on November 14th, Thursday, at 3 p.m. in Hubbard Hall 211. This is going to be a really exciting talk. Kathy Stewart, who is the Assistant Director in the Office of Disability Services, is going to talk to us about American Sign Language. Kathy will actually make this a really interactive kind of workshop. So if you have been interested in American Sign Language, or you are a user of American Sign Language, you want to know more about sign language, this is going to be the place that you want to come to. The talk is titled Home, the 5 basic components of ASL in linguistics. So she is going to be talking about hand shape, orientation of the palm, location, movement, and expression, etc. And so this is a really, really exciting talk. I'm really excited for it. And I will be opening this up for extra credit. So if you feel that you need extra credit in this class, do show up for this talk. And I had a couple of students show up for the first Language and Linguistics Colloquium talk, and I was really happy to see them, because I don't know many of you by face, and I am a professor who really likes to get to know her students. And so teaching online is one of those areas where I don't have a lot of interaction with you personally. So it's really good to put a face to your names. I know all your names. I just don't have a face associated with them. I do have your visual roster, but that's not similar to meeting you in person. So if you are free and you want some extra credit, do show up and do come and say hi to me. I will be there introducing Kathy Stewart, so feel free to come and talk to me. You have new readings for this week. This is chapter 8 of your textbooks, pages 236 to 245. And so let's kind of remind you where we are in the semester. We're kind of getting to the end of it. This is the second last module. We have kind of reached that stage of the idea of what linguistics is. So we know how to build words. We know how to put them together and create sentences. We know how to derive meaning from that. And now we're kind of getting into that area where world knowledge and what we know about the world is going to influence the way in which we understand meaning. And that area of linguistics is what we call as pragmatics, because when we talk, we are always talking in a context. And it's this context that we talk about when we are talking about pragmatics. So pragmatics is the relation between language and the context of its use, a study of the relation between how we use language and the context in which we use language. That is what we call pragmatics. When we talk about pragmatics, we often talk about discourse. So if you've heard the term discourse analysis, if you've heard the term text analysis, that is all part of applied linguistics. It's part of pragmatics as intersecting with, say, technology or computer science, etc. It's a very, very upcoming field. It's a field that has been that has gotten a lot of attention recently because of Facebook and Twitter and other kinds of media that are generating tons of data and tons of text. So if that is something that interests you, if that's a career option that you are interested in exploring, taking an advanced course in pragmatics is going to be really useful for you. So what we talk about when we talk about discourse is anything that is kind of above the sentence level. So it could be a paragraph, it could be a speech, it could be an essay, a poem, etc. So discourse is something that is above the sentence level, above the clause level, but it's also kind of coherent, right? So when you talk about an essay, there really has to be a big theme that's connecting the essay. And so that's the kind of discourse that we're talking about, right? A discourse that's structured, a discourse that's meaningful, and a discourse that is viewed as social practice. We talk about discourse analysis that we study when we are studying any kind of discourse, really. So it could be speech, it could be written text, it could be an essay, it could be a novel. If you're studying any of this, then you're really kind of in discourse analysis. And when we talk about discourse analysis, we often talk about performance. And the easiest analogy that I use when I teach performance is basically, you're all competent people, right? I mean, you can, if you really put your mind to it, you can get an A in linguistics. But your performance is dependent on whether you ate breakfast this morning, or you listened to music, or you had 9 hours of sleep, or you had dinner or lunch with your significant other. That's really going to determine your performance on that particular day. So it's not that you're not competent, but it's just that your competence is very different from your performance, right? I mean, you can perform in a particular fashion on a particular day and perform completely differently on another day, depending on the factors that govern that particular day. Versus when you talk about syntax, semantics, and other areas of linguistics that we've looked at so far, we have been in the realm of competence, right? Because we've been really thinking about how language happens in the brain. And this is the first area that we're talking about, where we're talking about language as it happens in society, right? So we can talk about two kinds of definitions of discourse. We can talk about a structural discourse and a functional definition of discourse. When you talk about a structural definition, we are really talking about a particular unit of language. So we can talk about speech versus written text, versus an essay, versus a novel, versus a poem, versus some kind of rapping, etc. And then with a functional definition of language, you can talk about the focus of that particular language, right? So what is the purpose of this poem? What is the purpose of this particular written format, right? That's the functional definition of discourse. When we talk about structural ways of analyzing discourse, you can really think about morphology, you can think about constituency, you can think about syntax, right? So how are these interconnected with each other? That is what we mean by the structural approach to discourse. But the problem with structural approaches to discourse is that people don't always write or talk grammatically. So here's an example from a book by Alice Walker. It's called The Color Purple. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend this book. And I'm going to read out this paragraph from Alice Walker's Color Purple. Jack is tall and kind and don't hardly say anything. Love children, respect his wife Odessa and all Odessa Amazon sisters. Now, if you are a standard speaker of American English, which most of you will be, you will tell me that a lot of these sentences don't seem complete, or they don't seem very grammatical to you. This is because this particular paragraph has certain inflections that are missing, like the apostrophe S, or plural marking, or any kind of tense inflections. And this kind of English is very often treated to be ungrammatical English, but it is spoken by an ethnic community called African American Vernacular English Speakers. It's called AAVE. This is the linguistically correct terminology to refer to the English spoken by African Americans. And this kind of English is very often treated to be wrong, right? And that's the problem with structure, because what is the kind of structure that's handed down to us? I mean, what structure do we say is right and what structure do we say is wrong, right? If you look at linguistics, nothing is right or wrong, right? There are just different ways of saying things. There are different preferences. There are different people who speak very differently. But that's not the way that you're taught structure or discourse in universities, right? Or in high school and middle school. There are also sentences such as these that are famous linguistic examples. This one is given by Professor Noam Chomsky. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And the idea is that syntactically, you know how the constituency works over here. You know how to put these phrases together. But semantically, the sentence really does not mean anything. And here's a fun exercise for you if you are going to watch a movie over Thanksgiving or for your winter break. Look for other sentences like this in movies, and I bet that you will find many kinds of examples like these, because these are sentences that are structurally grammatical, but semantically meaning-wise, they actually don't amount to anything. The functional approach to discourse was given by a philosopher and a linguist called Roman Jakobson, who's Russian, and he defined the functional approach to discourse as the 6 communicative functions of language. And these are the addressor function or the emotive function, the addressee function or the conative function, the context function or the referential function, the contact function or the phatic function, the message function or the poetic function, and the code, which is the metalinguistic. And I'm going to take each of these and explain to you what these mean. The first function is called the addressor function or the emotive function of language. And so when we talk about emotions, you can talk about certain kinds of words that are called as interjections in language. These are things like shoo, hooray, ouch, woohoo, right? So these are interjections. These kind of express a physical, a kind of internal emotion, right? Not a physical, sometimes physical, like ouch, but mostly like an internal emotion. Like, what are you going through, right? Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you stressed? Are you tired? And here's an example for you. Woohoo, Thanksgiving is next week, right? I mean, majority of you are going to be happy because we have a holiday that's coming up. And so it's a time for you to rest up, watch a couple of movies, right? Go out for a drink or something like that. So it's something that is relieving to you. And this is the emotive function of language, right? Or the addressor function of language. The context is the referential function of language. And here is an example of a context. So the present king of France is bald. Now, if I ask you if you understand the meaning of the sentence, you probably will say yes. But if I ask you, is there a present king of France, you will probably say no, because France is not a monarchy. There used to be a king of France, but not anymore. But you still understand the meaning. And this is because this kind of a term is called as a definite description. You are defining and describing something. So there's a context to it. It's a referential kind of context. You can refer to somebody and say, that is the president of America, right? Or how's the weather there, with like a pointing kind of gesture. And that's what we mean by the referential function of language. It's a context. It's kind of like a temporal context, at location, right? Or it situates a particular object in time and space. The conative function is the addressee function, and these are things that are very often used with the imperative kind of case marking or the vocative case marking. In English, they are often written with an exclamation mark, so something like, Tom, pay attention in class, or, oh, Jesus, our Savior, right? Very often written with the exclamation mark. And so these kind of functions in discourse are used to address the receiver or the hearer of the message, right? In this case, Tom or Jesus. The phatic function of language is also called as contact, and this very often happens when you meet another person and you want to talk about, you want to exchange pleasantries with the person. Very often people talk about how's the weather today, or how are you, and that kind of thing. So the weather is good today, bye, see you later, etc. are phatic functions where if you come into contact with a stranger, you are most likely going to say in that particular context. The poetic function of language or the message function of language is very often things like reduplication, where you talk about, I want two of those, right? Or I want a salad, right? Not just any salad, but I want a salad, and that kind of thing. So here's an example. Why do you always say Joanne and Marjorie, yet never Marjorie and Joanne? Do you prefer Joanne to her twin sister? Not at all. It just sounds smoother. So these are things that we consciously or subconsciously take a decision when we are speaking language, like using Joanne and Marjorie and not Marjorie and Joanne, right? So these are instances of the discourse being a poetic kind of function. And the last function, sixth function of language, is code or metalinguistic. And this is when we are using language to talk about language. I am using English as a medium to communicate linguistics to you or teach linguistics to you. And that is what we mean by metalinguistic or code. It's when the medium of communication occurs using language itself, right? When we talk about discourse, we often talk about social practice when we're talking about text analysis or discourse analysis. It has to be in that particular social structure, right? It's in a society. Conversations and communication happens in society. So everything that we talk about has to be regulated by society and social norms. So one of the most influential theories that came up in the 1960s with respect to the fact that communication happens through social practice and as a social norm is called the Speech Act theory. The Speech Act theory simply says when we speak, we do things. So basically, any utterance of ours has a repercussion, and we should be very careful when we use words or when we write, because it could harm somebody, it could hurt somebody, and so when we speak, we have to be careful, right? The theory was proposed by two linguists, J.L. Austin and John Searle, in the 1960s. They were linguists at UC Berkeley in California, and the Speech Act theory has three main components, right? And very often students get confused between the three, so it's very easy for you if you can remember an illustration of these to keep these separately in your head. The Speech Act theory says that there are three acts: the locutionary act, the illocutionary act, and the perlocutionary act. I'm going to illustrate each of these with an example. The locutionary act is an utterance with a particular meaning. So if I say something like, dang, I forgot to go to the ATM, the locutionary act in this case is that you forgot to go to the ATM, you forgot to go to the bank. So you're literally telling somebody that I was supposed to go to the bank, but I couldn't go to the bank and I forgot to go to the bank, right? So this is called a locutionary act because there is a particular meaning associated with it, and that is what you're conveying by saying, dang, I forgot to go to the ATM. The illocutionary act of the same statement is basically, suppose you and your friend have gone to AMC to watch a movie, and you realize that the ATM machine, you realize that the card machine is not accepting any cards and you don't have any cash on you, and you say, dang, I forgot to go to the ATM to your friend. What you're trying to say kind of indirectly is basically, I don't have money, please lend me some cash so that we can buy a ticket and watch the movie, right? So the illocutionary act is the non-literate meaning or the indirect meaning, and it talks about asking, answering, or promising something, right? So the locutionary act is the literal meaning associated with the statement, and the illocutionary act is the indirect or the hidden meaning associated with that. And the perlocutionary act for the same sentence is basically the effect that this has on your friend. Your friend feels sorry for you. The friend gives you $10 so that you can buy a ticket and watch the movie with your friend. So the effect that this statement has on somebody else, on the hearer, right, is what we call a perlocutionary act. So locutionary act, literal meaning, direct meaning. Illocutionary act is the indirect meaning, and the perlocutionary act is the effect that this has on the person who's listening to that particular sentence. Sometimes the illocutionary act and the perlocutionary act combines together, and when this happens, it is called as illocutionary force. Now, here's an example of this. Imagine two people are having a conversation, Daniel and John. Daniel tells John, there's a coffee shop on the corner, right? Because John's house is around the corner, so Daniel says, there's a coffee shop on the corner. But John interprets Daniel's utterance as a request. What Daniel was trying to say was, Daniel was just merely saying that, look, there's a coffee shop in the corner. I'm just giving you this information. But John interprets Daniel's utterance as a request, so he interprets that as an illocutionary act, not as a locutionary act, and says, oh, I have 20 minutes to grab a cup of coffee with you if that's what you want to do. So this is when your illocutionary act combines with the perlocutionary act, and it's called illocutionary force, right? So there's a coffee shop on the corner. Your friend misinterprets this and says, oh, I have 20 minutes to grab a cup of coffee with you, right? So that is called as illocutionary force. Now, illocutionary acts, because it is non-literate meaning and indirect meaning, you can classify these further into 5 different categories. There's a very nice table in your chapter, so I highly recommend you to make a note of that table, because it's easy if you have a visual kind of stimuli to remember this. But these are the 5 categories of illocutionary act. The first one is called as representative or assertive. And this are things like suggesting, boasting, concluding, telling, describing, etc. Very often, these are declarative sentences, right? So there's a sentence in a declarative, it's a positive sentence, right? And very often that is a representative or an assertive because you're telling the person something. The second kind of illocutionary act is a directive. The directive often tells you to do something, right? So you're ordering somebody, you're commanding somebody, you're challenging somebody. Very often it is an interrogative, right? Can you do something is an example of directive, or an imperative, Tom, do that, right? Kind of thing. The third example of an illocutionary act is commissive. So these are things like promising somebody, threatening somebody, refraining somebody from doing something, right? So it's always designed to get the speaker to do something. That's a commissive. Expressive is when you are congratulating somebody, you are thanking somebody, you are apologizing to somebody just with the act of apologizing, saying thank you, sorry, congratulations, you are expressing the mental state, right, of the speaker. And the last one is declarations. This is when just by saying something, the speaker is bringing about that state of being. So you're blessing somebody, or you're baptizing somebody, or excommunicating somebody. Just by declaring that, you are bringing about that state of affairs. There are also 2 kinds of speech acts. You can talk about the direct speech act and the indirect speech act. The direct speech act is basically when the locutionary act and the illocutionary act corresponds directly, right? So I forgot to go to the ATM. You're not saying, dang, I forgot to go to the ATM. You're just saying, I forgot to go to the ATM. This is a very direct kind of speech act. It's a declarative statement. And the illocutionary force over here is an assertion, right? Remember, we talked about representative and assertive. These are declarative statements. And therefore, the locutionary act and the illocutionary act kind of merges together to create the direct speech act. The indirect speech act is when you have the locutionary speech act and the illocutionary speech act is 2 different things. So, dang, I forgot to go to the ATM, right, is when the utterance is an exclamation and the illocutionary force is a directive, right? And the intended meaning does not correspond to the propositional meaning. We talk with indirect speech acts all the time, right? We hope to speak indirect speech acts, but very often we resort to indirect speech acts because that's human nature. We can also talk about performative speech acts, and these are things like thank you, you're fired, apologizing, etc. So very similar to the illocutionary speech acts that we saw with like expressives and declarations. So we can just call these as performative speech acts when we're using a verb to perform an action, like thank you, you're fired, I apologize, etc. And we can also talk about constitutive speech acts, and these are basically the opposite of performative speech acts. These are speech acts that can be kind of evaluated against truth values. So they're very similar to kind of like the statements that we saw in semantics when we were doing propositional logic. These are called as constitutive speech acts. There's been a lot of criticism against speech act theory. Like I said, it was a really popular theory in the 1960s, but not anymore. And this is because a lot of communication happens without language, without sentences, without, us meaning anything, right? So hello, whatever, right? So here's an example. If I ask you to choose between May 3rd and May 10th as your final exam dates, and you say whatever because you really don't care, what kind of a speech act is that? Is that locutionary, illocutionary, perlocutionary? We really don't know. So speech act theory is really good as a fundamental basis of understanding pragmatics and having a way of starting to do discourse analysis, but really it's not a very popular theory today in 2019. All right, so that's where we end this module. In the next module, what we are going to be doing is we are going to start talking about Gricean maxims. So I will see you next week.